I was counted before I was condemned, and that distinction matters to the Imperium. Counting is orderly. Condemnation is implied. I remember the hall where it happened more clearly than I remember my own habitation block, because the hall had purpose. It smelled of old paper, machine oil, and incense that had long since lost its sweetness. The ceiling was lost in shadow, swallowed by arches and suspended cogitators that clicked and whined like insects feeding on data. Lines of us stood pressed together in absolute silence, broken only by coughing, the shuffle of boots, and the distant tolling of a bell that marked shifts rather than hours. I had believed, truly believed, that faith was something spoken, something felt. I had been wrong. Faith, I learned that day, begins as a discrepancy in a ledger. The administratum clerks sat behind a counter that stretched the length of the hall, each of them framed by brass rails and parchment racks. They were pale, thin people, their eyes augmented with lenses that flickered as they read. None of them looked up. Not once. Hands moved in precise, repetitive motions: stamp, slide, stamp, slide. The sound was deafening in its regularity, a hammer driving us toward whatever fate lay beyond the counter. Servo skulls drifted overhead, projecting binaric prayers and tally numbers onto the walls so that we could see progress being made, even if it was not our progress. When it was my turn, I stepped forward because the man behind me pushed, not because I was cold. The clerk did not ask my name. He asked for my documentation. I fumbled for it. Fingers numb from standing too long in the cold air, pumped through the hall to preserve the parchment. He took the papers with a metal claw where his left hand should have been and fed them into a reader that hummed angrily, as if offended by my existence. "You are in arrears," he said, voice flat, distorted by a vox grill embedded in his throat. "Spiritual the unpaid. Pilgrimage designation assigned." That was it. No accusation. No opportunity to speak. The words were not a sentence, they were a classification. A stamp came down hard enough to bruise my knuckles as he returned the papers, now marked with a red sigil that bled through every layer. I was no longer a citizen in good standing. I was a pilgrim. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that I attended the sermons, that I burned incense on the appointed days, that I whispered prayers before sleep when the manufactorum sirens finally fell silent. But the next person was already being processed, and a shock prod tapped my spine to remind me to move. Faith was not measured in intention. It was measured in compliance. They herded us into secondary queues after that, splitting us by destination codes that none of us understood. I stood for hours beneath flickering lumen strips, watching people slump and sink to the floor when their legs failed them. Medici orderlies came only when bodies stopped moving, and even then, only to tag them and drag them away. Death was an administrative inconvenience, noted and filed. No prayers were spoken over the fallen. There was no time. I told myself this was necessary. I told myself that endurance was devotion, that the emperor, or whatever divine machinery watched over us, saw this suffering and approved. The preachers always said faith was proven under strain. They never mentioned how impersonal that strain would be. The queues stretched beyond the hall, out into corridors that spiraled through the hive's lower spires. Kilometers, some said, though distance was hard to judge when you could not see the end. Time blurred. Bells rang, shift horns sounded. Somewhere above us, industry roared on, indifferent to the quiet misery accumulating below. People prayed aloud at first, voices overlapping in desperate harmony. Over time, the prayers thinned into murmurs, then into silence broken only by sobbing. I watched an old woman collapse 3 places ahead of me. She clutched a small icon to her chest, lips moving soundlessly. The man beside her tried to help her up, and an enforcer struck him across the back with a baton for disrupting the line. The woman was stepped over. When she did not move again, a servo skull descended, scanned her, and projected a brief rune indicating termination. Her icon was kicked aside to keep the walkway clear. I learned then that pilgrimage was not a reward. It was a mechanism, a way to balance accounts written in ink and blood. Eventually, we were issued transit chits, thin strips of plasteel stamped with departure times that meant nothing to us. Mine was cold in my hand, heavier than it looked. With it came a pamphlet printed on cheap parchment, its edges already fraying. It detailed the virtues of pilgrimage, the blessings awaiting those who endured, and the punishments reserved for those who faltered. The language was uplifting, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. We were given ration bars and instructed to report to the embarkation levels within 3 cycles. No one told us where to go. Signs were posted, but they contradicted each other, updated faster than we could follow. I wandered with the others through corridors lined with devotional murals depicting saints whose faces had been worn smooth by centuries of passing hands. I touched one as I passed, feeling nothing but cold stone. That night, or what passed for night beneath artificial light, I slept on the floor of a holding pen with hundreds of others. The air was thick with sweat and fear. Somewhere nearby, a preacher shouted litanies through a loud hailer, reminding us that doubt was a sin and that suffering was love made manifest. I listened until the words lost meaning, until they became just another noise layered over the hum of machinery. I tried to pray. I tried to feel grateful. Instead, I felt small, reduced. My life had been recalculated, my faith quantified and found wanting. Ahead of me lay the stars, and whatever waited at the end of this imposed devotion. Behind me lay everything I had known, already written off. That was when I understood the pilgrimage was not about reaching a holy place. It was about being processed until there was nothing left to process. Faith did not begin in the soul. It began on a form, stamped and approved, and it would end the same way. They marched us to the embarkation levels as if we were a contaminant that needed moving before it spread. The corridors rose and widened as we climbed, trading the hive's damp stone for rusted metal and the taste of recycled air. Every junction was watched by enforcers in visored helms, their rifles held low but ready, like shepherds guarding a flock they hated. The lighting changed too, less flicker, more harsh white glare, as if illumination itself were an interrogation. I kept my transit chit clenched in my fist until the edges cut into my palm, because it was the only proof I existed in the eyes of the system. The embarkation bay opened like a wound. There were ships, dozens of them, docked along skeletal gantries that vanished into darkness overhead. They were not the sleek, heroic vessels of devotional stained glass, but blunt, scarred transport hulks with patchwork plating and wheezing exhaust vents. They looked like they had been built to carry ore, then repurposed to carry people when the ore ran out. Their hulls were stamped with sigils of sanctity and warnings of infection in the same breath. Somewhere, a choir intoned a hymn through cracked vox speakers, the notes warping as if even sound struggled to survive in that place. They called it the Coffin Fleet, and I understood the name the moment I smelled it. The odor was a layered thing, disinfectant sharp as burnt vinegar, sweat sour and old, machine grease, incense, and beneath it all the faint sweet rot of too many bodies too close together for too long. It hung in the air like fog. When the bay doors cycled open to let another ship's cargo in, the void's chill swept through, and the smell shifted, as if the whole place exhaled. We were herded into pens marked by destination codes, each pen surrounded by chain, link fencing topped with barbed wire that served no functional purpose inside an imperial port, except to remind us we were contained. A clerk with a servo quill shouted our numbers, not names, never names, numbers like inventory, every time my code was spoken. It felt like something being tightened around my throat. When my pen was called, we moved as one tired mass along the gantry toward our assigned transport. The walkway swayed under our combined weight. Below us, the docking pit yawned open, full of shadow and the distant glimmer of hazard lights. I forced my eyes ahead, because looking down felt like inviting a fall. At the ship's mouth, the first true indignity of transit began inspection. A line of Medicare servitors stood under glaring lumen panels. Their flesh was pale, hairless, and stretched tight over skulls shaved to the bone. Augmetic arms ended in syringes, clamps, and scanning wands that clicked softly like feeding utensils. Each pilgrim stepped forward, raised their arms, and endured the probes. They took blood, they took skin scrapings, they pressed lenses to our eyes and needles to our tongues. When someone flinched, a servitor's restraint claw would snap out and hold them still with inhuman force. The servitors did not speak. Their work was silent, efficient, and intimate in the way a butcher is intimate with meat. I remember the sensation of cold metal against my neck as a scanner traced the line of my veins. I remember the sting of antiseptic sprayed into my mouth until I gagged. I remember the taste bitter, chemical, holy by decree. A small seal was slapped onto my transit chit when I was cleared, ink still wet, as if I might smear into nothing if not anchored. Then we were pushed inside. The interior was not a corridor so much as a throat. Walls sweated condensation. Pipes ran along the ceiling like exposed veins, dripping onto the crowd. Lumen strips buzzed, their light jaundiced and thin. The air grew warmer and thinner with each step. We moved down into the ship, deeper into a belly already full. The Pilgrim holds were stacked in tiers, each a long chamber of metal ribs and bolted benches. There were no private spaces, no partitions, no mercy. We were packed shoulder to shoulder, knees pressed to backs, faces inches from strangers. A thin layer of grime coated every surface. When I sat, my trousers stuck slightly as if the bench itself resented being touched. Someone behind me began to pray immediately, voice trembling but loud. Others joined, desperate for ritual to make sense of the crush. The prayer became a chant. The chant became a dull roar that filled the hold and bounced off the metal walls. It should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like the sound people make when they are trying not to scream. I slept upright because there was no other way. When exhaustion finally forced my eyes closed, I drifted in and out of shallow dreams, always waking when the ship shuddered or a body shifted too violently beside me. The hold was alive with small sounds, coughing, whimpering, the scrape of boots, the wet rattle of phlegm in throats. The smell grew worse. Breath became a shared substance, passed from mouth to mouth, warmed and used. They gave us rations, small blocks of compressed nutrient paste, and a cup of water rationed by a spout that dribbled like a dying animal. The paste tasted of chalk and metal and faint sweetness, engineered to be palatable and failing at it. I ate anyway, because hunger was not a choice. The man beside me hoarded his ration in his sleeve, fingers shaking, eyes wide with a panic so naked it frightened me more than the enforcers did. On the second day he tried to steal from the dead. Yes, dead. They came quickly. At first, it was the weak, the old woman with the icon, the feverish child whose mother kept whispering that the shrine world would heal him, the man whose lungs had been eaten by manufactorum dust long before he ever saw a ship. They died silently in the press. Their bodies kept upright by the crowd until someone noticed their heads lolling at the wrong angle. Then it became less predictable. A man 2 benches down simply stopped breathing, eyes open as if surprised. A young woman convulsed and bit through her own tongue, choking on blood while those around her tried not to look. Someone screamed that it was possession, that the warp was in her, and the scream sparked a wave of terror that rippled through the hold like heat. That was when the enforcers came. They wore rebrither masks and carried shock mauls. They did not soothe. They did not explain. They climbed into the hold and struck indiscriminately until the panic became silence. Then they began the daily reading, each ship cycle, at a time marked by the changing pitch of the engine's hum. A vox horn crackled to life. An enforcer's voice, filtered, bored, read casualty numbers. Never names. Hold 3, Section 712 expired. Hold 5, Section 2. 9 expired. It was delivered in the same tone one might use to list broken machine parts. After the reading, servitors arrived. They were different from the medica. These were cargo servitors, heavy, limbed things with blank faces and hooked hands. They moved through the aisles, pulling bodies free with mechanical patience. When a corpse snagged on a bench or a pilgrim's leg, the servitor did not adjust gently, it yanked harder until something tore. The sound of cloth ripping and joints popping became part of the ship's music. I watched one servitor drag a dead child by the ankle, the small body bumping over metal ridges. The mother did not cry out. She stared straight ahead, lips moving in prayer, as if any acknowledgement would make it real. I hated her for her discipline. I envied it too. Days blurred into a grey smear. The ship's lights never fully dimmed. The hymns through the Vox speakers continued, but they grew faint and distorted, as if the machine spirit itself was tired. Our chanting became less frequent. Throats were raw, voices cracked. People conserved breath. And then there was the void. I had imagined the void as a vast, clean emptiness, a place where the Emperor's light might be clearer. Instead, it was pressure against the hull, a constant reminder that everything outside wanted you dead. Sometimes the ship would groan, metal complaining under strain, and the sound would travel through the benches into my bones. In those moments, I felt the scale of it, the infinite dark, the cold that could swallow this coffin whole and never notice. I understood then how cheap we were. We were cargo. We were ballast. We were a living tithe paid forward to a holy world that would barely register our arrival. The ship did not care if we lived. The clerks had already stamped the paperwork. The numbers would balance either way. One night, I call it night because my mind needs the concept, not because the lights changed, the engine stuttered. The hold shook, people gasped, clutching at each other, fear surging like bile. The Vox horn barked an order: remain seated, recite the litany of safe passage. Non-compliance will be corrected. We recited. Of course we did. Our voices were weak, but they were many, and the words were drilled into us from childhood. I spoke them with a dry mouth and a pounding heart, not because I believed they protected us, but because disobedience was punished with certainty, while the void's threats were abstract. The engines resumed. The ship steadied. A wave of exhausted relief passed through the hold, followed quickly by shame, relief that we were still alive, shame that we wanted to be. By the time the next ration came, I no longer thought of the pilgrimage as cleansing. I thought of it as attrition, a slow grinding down of bodies and hope, measured in casualty readings and the diminishing sound of hymns. I still whispered prayers, but they had become smaller, less ambitious, not for salvation, not for blessing, just for enough air, and somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the fear and hunger and bureaucratic certainty, a colder understanding took root. If this was the journey toward holiness, then holiness was simply another word for endurance under indifferent machinery. When the coffin fleet finally shuddered into stillness, there was no cheer, no sigh of relief. The engines wound down with a tired, grinding moan, like an animal finally giving up. For a long moment, nothing happened. We sat frozen on the benches, listening to the hull tick and cool, afraid that movement itself might be punished. Then the Vox horn crackled, and an enforcer's voice told us we had arrived at the holy perimeter. The word holy sounded wrong coming through that speaker, distorted and mechanical, stripped of warmth. The airlock doors opened, and the shrine world greeted us with sirens, not bells, not hymns. Sirens, long, wailing alarms that echoed down the gantries and vibrated in my chest. The air that rushed in was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of disinfectant and burned incense in such concentration it made my eyes water. Through the open hatch I saw gun towers, rows of them, rising like skeletal fingers against a sky the color of old parchment. Their barrels tracked the disembarking ships with slow, deliberate movements, as if the world itself was watching us arrive and deciding whether we were worth the ammunition. We were ordered out in ranks, though no one bothered to help us form them. People stumbled down the ramp, legs stiff from confinement, some collapsing outright onto the metal deck. Enforcers waited at the bottom, shock prods already humming. If you fell, you were shocked until you stood or stopped moving. I learned quickly which option they preferred. The spaceport was enormous, a sacred industrial sprawl of landing pads, quarantine halls, and towering statues depicting saints in poses of suffering so exaggerated they bordered on parody. Their stone faces were cracked and eroded, mouths frozen in eternal screams or beatific agony. I wondered how many pilgrims had died beneath their gaze without ever looking up. We were herded into the quarantine halls immediately. There was no pause to take in the sight of the shrine world itself, no moment of awe. Holiness, it seemed, was dangerous until proven otherwise. The halls were white, too white, every surface scrubbed and sealed. The light was brutal, reflecting off metal and plasteel until my vision swam. Lines were painted on the floor, directing traffic in precise flows that intersected and split according to sigils I didn't recognize. Servo skulls drifted overhead, chanting warnings about contamination, heresy, and unauthorized prayer. Unauthorized prayer. The phrase lodged in my mind like a splinter. We were ordered to strip. There was no modesty, no separation by age or sex. Clothing was considered a vector, and vectors were to be eliminated. We stood naked under the lights, gooseflesh rising on skin that had known only the stagnant warmth of the ship for weeks. I crossed my arms instinctively, and a servitor slapped them down with a metal limb, emitting a chiding tone as if correcting a misfiled document. The cleansing began. Jets of sanctified chemicals sprayed from the walls, a fine mist that coated us head to toe. It burned. Not enough to blister, but enough to make every nerve scream. The smell was overpowering, sharp, medicinal, with an undercurrent of incense that did nothing to soften it. People coughed and gagged. Some screamed prayers. The servitors moved among us, scrubbing with stiff brushes that tore at skin, probing orifices with instruments that clicked and whirred. I remember the feeling of a brush rasping over my back, scraping away layers of grime, and something else, comfort, perhaps, or the last illusion of dignity. I remember a probe pressed against my eye, forcing it open while a lens scanned for impurities I could not see. I remember the taste of chemicals dripping into my mouth, making my tongue numb. Those who reacted too strongly, who fought, who collapsed, who screamed too loudly, were pulled aside. I saw them dragged through side doors marked with sigils that did not appear on the main flow charts. No one explained what reassignment meant. We all pretended not to notice. After cleansing came inspection, Medicare servitors again, but these were more elaborate, their augmetics adorned with purity seals and small hanging sensors that swung as they moved. They took more samples, cross-referenced data, consulted cogitators embedded in their own torsos. A red light meant rejection. A green light meant you were permitted to continue. The lights flickered constantly as people passed through, and every red flash was followed by a brief struggle, then silence as the rejected were marched away. I passed under a green light by chance. I know that now. At the time, I wanted to believe it was because I was worthy, because my faith had somehow manifested in my flesh. But I had seen the randomness already. The child, who passed one scan only to fail the next. The man cleared while the woman beside him was taken away for a tremor in her hands. The system was thorough, not just. It culled by thresholds, not by virtue. Once cleared, we were issued new robes, thin, rough cloth stamped with pilgrimage sigils, and a small token bearing our inspection code. Losing it, we were warned, would result in immediate detention. I tied mine into the robe's cord and checked it obsessively, fingers brushing it every few steps like a nervous tick. Beyond quarantine, the shrine world unfolded in layers of stone and steel. Cathedrals rose beside manufactorum spires. Processional roads cut through blocks like scars. Everywhere there were cameras, servo, skulls, and armed figures watching from elevated walkways. Faith here was not a private matter. It was enforced infrastructure. The soundscape was overwhelming. Bells rang at irregular intervals, overlapping with chanting broadcast from unseen speakers. Orders barked by enforcers cut through the noise, sharp and precise. Somewhere deeper in the city, heavy machinery pounded, a reminder that even holy worlds had quotas to meet. We were marched through a vast gatehouse that marked the boundary of the inner sanctum. The gate itself was a cathedral facade turned sideways, its doors carved with scenes of martyrdom, so detailed I could see individual teeth in the screaming mouths. Above it all, a massive inscription declared the world sanctified and warned that impurity would be met with absolute correction. As we passed through, a priest stood on a raised platform, flanked by armed attendants. He blessed us with a sweeping gesture, his words amplified and flattened by a vox system. "You are seen," he intoned. "You are measured. You will be improved." I felt nothing, not awe, not relief, just a hollow fatigue that settled deeper into my bones. Around me, some pilgrims wept openly, overwhelmed by finally reaching this place. Others fell to their knees despite the orders to keep moving, overcome by devotion or exhaustion or both. They were shocked back to their feet without hesitation. I caught a glimpse of those who had been rejected earlier, herded along a distant walkway behind fencing. Their robes were different, marked with warning sigils. Guards marched them toward a complex of low buildings belching smoke. Reassignment. Someone whispered near me, voice trembling. No one asked what that meant. We all knew enough not to. As we were funneled onward toward temporary holding quarters, I realized something that chilled me more than the chemicals or the guns. This world did not want us here. Not really. We were a burden, a necessary influx of bodies to sustain a system built on devotion and decay. Holiness was not a welcoming embrace. It was a gauntlet. I had survived the void. I had passed the cleansing. I was inside the holy perimeter by the narrowest of margins. And yet, standing beneath the towering walls and unblinking surveillance, I felt smaller than ever. My presence here was provisional, conditional, always one misstep away from correction. Holiness, I understood then, was not something you felt in your soul. It was something imposed on your body, enforced by scanners, sirens, and men with guns. And as I followed the painted lines deeper into the shrine world, I felt the last scraps of my earlier hope flake away, leaving only obedience behind. They did not give us time to rest. Rest implied mercy, and mercy was rationed more tightly than food. After a single holding cycle in the dormitory pens, bare floors, recycled air, sermons broadcast at a volume that made sleep impossible, we were assembled again beneath the open sky. The shrine world's light was pale and sickly, filtered through layers of pollution and incense smoke that blurred the sun into a dull, watchful disk. I remember thinking that even the heavens here were tired. A priest read the order of procession from a lectern mounted on tracks. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as he explained that the processional way must be traversed as an act of humility. We would walk it on our knees. This was not a punishment, he assured us. It was an honor. Those who completed it would be spiritually elevated. Those who failed would be spiritually corrected. The stone road stretched ahead of us, wide enough for armored vehicles and lined with statues of saints flayed, pierced, or burned in exquisite detail. The surface was ancient, polished smooth by centuries of pilgrims, but cracked in places where repairs had been hurried or abandoned. I could already see dark stains embedded in the stone, old blood ground in so deeply it had become part of the road's color. At the signal, we knelt. The first contact was a shock. Knees that had known only metal decking and rough flooring met cold stone, and pain flared bright and immediate. Around me, people hissed and gasped as their weight settled. Enforcers moved along the ranks, shock prods ready, ensuring compliance. Someone hesitated, just a second too long, and went down hard under a crackling blow. "Begin," the priest said. We moved forward on our knees. At first, I tried to be careful, shifting my weight slowly, placing my hands ahead of me to ease the pressure. That lasted perhaps 10 meters. The pace was set by those behind pushing forward, and those ahead collapsing. Soon there was no room for caution. The stone scraped through the thin cloth of my robes and bit into skin. I felt it tear, felt warmth spread as blood flowed freely. Every movement was a choice between pain now and pain worse later. The sounds were overwhelming. The scrape of flesh on stone, the wet slap of hands catching falls, prayers muttered, shouted, screamed, the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground when legs or will finally failed. Above it all, the bells rang, marking progress in measured intervals that did not align with distance or relief. I tasted dust constantly. It coated my tongue and teeth, mixed with blood and incense until everything tasted the same, dry, metallic, faintly sweet. My hands shook as they pressed against the road, fingers slipping on slick patches left by those ahead. I learned quickly not to look too closely at the stains, not to wonder whose blood it was or how long ago it had been spilled. Priests watched from balconies that ran the length of the processional way. They stood in neat rows, robes immaculate, hands folded. Servo skulls hovered beside them, recording everything: compliance rates, collapse points, time to failure. I knew, without being told, that this data would be used to refine the ritual, to make it more efficient. When someone collapsed fully, when their knees buckled, and they could not rise again, there was a brief pause around them, a ripple of hesitation as others tried to maneuver past. Enforcers stepped in immediately. Sometimes they dragged the fallen away by the arms or legs, leaving streaks of blood behind. Sometimes, if the body still twitched, they left it where it lay, a living obstacle to be climbed over. Inspiration. I heard one priest say through a loudspeaker, his tone approving, "Observe the cost of weakness." I crawled past a man who had stopped moving entirely, his face pressed into the stone, eyes open and unfocused. Someone had stepped on his hand, crushing fingers flat against the road. He did not react. I wondered, briefly, if he felt nothing, or everything at once. As the march continued, time lost meaning. There was only the rhythm of movement: shift, scrape, gasp, pray. My knees burned, then went numb. then burned again as nerves protested the abuse. Blood soaked into the cloth and dried, sticking it to my skin, so that every movement tore it loose again. My hands were worse. The skin split and peeled, nails cracked, joints screamed. I could not stop shaking. At some point, the chanting changed. What had begun as familiar prayers devolved into fragmented phrases, words slurred and repeated because they were all we had left. Endure, witness, forgive. Each syllable cost breath, and breath was precious. I became aware of a strange narrowing of my world. The statues blurred. The priests became distant shapes. All that existed was the stone in front of me and the next meter of ground. I told myself that if I could just reach that crack, that discoloration, that point where the stone changed texture, I could stop. I never could. The goalposts kept moving, literally dragged forward by those who survived longer than I expected. Someone beside me began to laugh. It was a thin, broken sound, halfway to a sob. He laughed every time his knee hit the stone, as if his mind had decided this was the only way to cope. An enforcer noticed and struck him, shouting something about reverence. The laughter turned into a scream, then into nothing at all as the man collapsed and was dragged away. The smell of blood grew stronger as we progressed, overpowering even the incense. Flies gathered in dark clouds despite the sanctity of the place, drawn to open wounds and exposed flesh. Servo skulls sprayed something into the air, repellent, disinfectant, both, but it only dulled the edges of the stench. I do not know how far we went. Kilometers perhaps, or perhaps it only felt that way because every meter demanded payment in pain. At some point, my knees no longer felt like part of my body. They were distant, abstract sources of agony that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. My vision tunneled. The bells became muffled, as if underwater. I remember thinking, with a strange clarity, that this was what the Imperium wanted, not my faith, but my proof of submission, my blood on their stone, my endurance logged and recorded. If I died here, I would still have served my purpose as a warning and a data point. That thought did not make me stop. It made me continue. When the order to halt finally came, it rippled backward slowly, delayed by exhaustion and disbelief. I slumped forward, forehead touching the stone, and stayed there until an enforcer kicked my shoulder and told me to rise. Standing was worse than kneeling. My legs shook violently, threatening to fold. When I looked down, my knees were a mess of torn flesh and darkened blood, swollen and angry. They did not offer bandages. They did not offer water. A priest announced that the march had been deemed sufficient for the day. Those who remained standing were commended. Those who did not were being attended to. As we were herded away, limping and bleeding, I looked back once at the processional way. Servitors were already at work, scrubbing the stone with mechanical brushes, washing away the blood so the road would be ready for the next group. The stains would return. They always did. I felt no pride, no spiritual elevation, only a deep, bone-level weariness and the understanding that each step closer to the relic would cost more than the last. I had paid in blood already, and the shrine world had accepted it without comment. This was not the worst of it. I knew that with a certainty that frightened me more than the pain. They funneled us from the processional way into the basilica complex without ceremony, as if we were refuse swept from one worksite to another. The transition was abrupt, from open stone and polluted sky into vaulted interiors so vast they swallowed sound. The doors sealed behind us with a boom that echoed like a coffin lid being shut. I remember flinching at that noise more than at any blow I had taken on the road. Outside, pain had space. Inside, it was trapped with us. The basilica never slept. I learned that quickly. There was no cycle of light or darkness, no indication of time beyond the fatigue clawing at my muscles. Lumen globes burned continuously, casting a yellow, white glare that flattened everything beneath it. The air was thick and warm, heavy with incense layered over the sour rot of too many bodies held too long in one place. The smell settled into my clothes, my hair, my wounds, until I could no longer tell where it ended and I began. This was the reliquary queue. It was not a single line, but a living architecture of bodies. Switchbacks of iron railings stretched across the basilica floor, climbing ramps, descending staircases, looping around columns the size of towers. Everywhere there were people, thousands, tens of thousands, shuffling forward in increments so small they barely counted as movement. The queue was a city within a cathedral, governed by its own brutal logic. We were assigned a section by code. A clerk, perched in a pulpit with a cogitator, shouted numbers while servo skulls projected them onto the walls. Miss your assignment, and you were removed for obstruction. I clutched my token and followed the painted arrows, limping, knees screaming with every step. There was no medical attention for the wounded unless infection threatened throughput. Pain was assumed. It was part of the experience. Once in place, we waited. At first, I thought I could endure it. After all, I had endured the march. I told myself this was passive suffering, easier than active pain. I was wrong. The queue demanded a different kind of payment, time, attention, and the slow erosion of the mind. We advanced perhaps a meter every few hours. Sometimes less, sometimes not at all. When movement stopped, it stopped completely, and the press of bodies closed in until breathing became shallow and careful. People leaned on one another without apology. There was no room for it. Chanting filled the basilica constantly. Choirs positioned high in the galleries sang hymns on endless rotation, their voices amplified and distorted until they became a wall of sound. Individual words were lost, replaced by tone and repetition. It seeped into my thoughts, wormed its way into dreams when I dozed standing up. Silence, when it came in brief system resets, was worse. It left nothing to focus on but discomfort and fear. Food was distributed irregularly. Servitors pushed carts along narrow service lanes, dispensing ration wafers and measured sips of water. If you were not paying attention, if you were asleep, distracted, or collapsed, you missed your allocation. No exceptions. I learned to keep my eyes half open at all times, to wake at the slightest change in air pressure or sound. Hunger sharpened that instinct brutally. People aged in the queue. I do not mean metaphorically. I watched faces hollow, hair thin, backs bend further with each passing cycle, wounds festered, knees swelled grotesquely, infection creeping in despite the supposedly sanctified air. When someone could no longer stand, those around them had a choice: hold them up and risk punishment for obstruction, or let them fall. Most let them fall. Bodies became markers. When someone died upright, wedged in place by the press, they stayed that way until enforcers arrived to clear them. In the meantime, people learned to navigate around the dead, using them as reference points. 2 passed the woman with the broken neck, just before the man slumped against the rail. Death became part of the map. Riots happened rarely, but when they did, they were sudden and violent. Hunger, despair, or the rumor of a faster route would spark them. A surge forward, a scream, someone shoved too hard. Enforcers responded instantly, shock mauls crackling, rifles barking short, sharp bursts into the air or into bodies when deterrence was required. The chanting never stopped. The hymns swallowed the screams. I remember one riot clearly because I was near the center of it. Someone shouted that a side gate had opened, that a shortcut was available for the faithful. The queue lurched as people pressed toward the sound. I was lifted off my feet for a moment, carried by the mass, panic flaring as I realized I had no control over my own movement. Then the shocks hit. Blue arcs of energy snapped across the crowd, dropping people where they stood. I hit the floor hard, my already ruined knees exploding with pain. I lay there, stunned, watching boots move past my face. Someone stepped on my hand and did not notice. An enforcer loomed over me, visor reflecting my own blood-smeared features back at me. For a moment, I thought he would finish it, one more body to clear. Instead, he prodded me until I rolled and crawled back into position. The riot had been corrected, throughput restored, weeks passed. I know this because my beard grew thick and matted, because my robe rotted at the hem, because the people around me changed. Faces I had come to recognize vanished, replaced by new ones shuffled in from behind. Some disappeared forward, having reached the inner gates. Others were removed backward, their codes flagged for reasons never explained. As I drew closer to the heart of the basilica, the air changed subtly. It grew warmer, heavier with incense and ozone. The chanting took on a different cadence, slower, more deliberate. I could see the inner gates now, massive barriers of gold and steel, bristling with weapon mounts and sensor arrays. Beyond them lay the reliquary itself. I realized then that I no longer cared. That realization frightened me more than anything else on the journey. I had dreamed of this moment once, imagined awe, tears, some overwhelming confirmation that the suffering meant something. Standing there, bones aching, stomach hollow, I felt nothing but a dull impatience. I wanted it to be over. Whatever it was, when I finally reached the final holding line before the gates, I barely noticed. A servitor scanned my token and waved me forward with a mechanical gesture. No congratulations, no blessing, just another step in the process. I tried to summon reverence. I tried to remember why I had wanted this. The words would not come. The hymns washed over me without meaning. The relic waited somewhere ahead, distant and abstract, and all I could think was how many had died in this place without ever seeing it. By the time the gates loomed fully before me, I understood a terrible truth. The queue was not just a path to holiness. It was a filter. And whatever part of me had entered with faith had been ground down and discarded somewhere along the way. The inner gates opened with a sound like restrained thunder, metal disengaging from metal in layers that spoke of ancient security protocols and absolute distrust. I had imagined a moment of ceremony, a pause, a prayer, some acknowledgement that we had endured enough to earn hesitation. Instead, the gates parted just wide enough to admit us in regulated groups, and enforcers waved us forward with practiced impatience. The queue did not dissolve, it tightened. Beyond the gates, the reliquary chamber rose upward in concentric tiers, a cathedral within a cathedral, its walls plated in gold and studded with weapon housings disguised as ornamentation. I could see them clearly now, heavy barrels recessed behind cherubic reliefs, sensor arrays hidden in halos. Holiness here was not fragile, it was fortified. The relic was there but distant. It sat at the chamber's center, elevated on a massive dais, enclosed within a lattice of gold struts and transparent armor plating etched with litanies. I could not make out its exact form from where I stood. Light bent around it strangely, refracted through layers of sanctified shielding and constant scanning beams. It was less an object than a presence, defined by what surrounded it rather than what it was. The sight of it did not strike me with awe. It struck me with a faint, wary curiosity, like seeing the source of a long-running administrative error. We were moved along a narrow causeway that spiraled inward toward the dais. The floor vibrated faintly beneath my feet, not from machinery, but from the constant hum of power, generators, void shields, weapon systems all running at readiness. I felt small walking there, exposed, acutely aware that every step was monitored, measured, evaluated. Priests lined the causeway, spaced at regular intervals. They wore heavy vestments stiff with embroidery and purity seals, faces hidden behind gilded masks that depicted serene expressions I doubted they actually possessed. Each held a scanner or a blessing device, some relic of ritualized bureaucracy that combined faith and function seamlessly. As I approached the first station, a servo skull descended, its lenses focusing on my face. Data scrolled across a small holo projection between us, my code, my inspection history, my compliance markers from the march and the queue. I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in the skull's polished casing, and barely recognized the figure staring back. Hollow cheeks, blood-crusted knees, eyes dulled by exhaustion. The priest did not look at me. He looked at the data. Pilgrim status confirmed. He intuned. Exposure permitted. Duration 3 seconds. 3 seconds. That was the sum total of my reward. I was pushed forward. The causeway narrowed until I stood alone on a small platform directly facing the relic's enclosure. The light intensified, bathing me in a harsh, white glare that erased shadows and flattened depth. For a moment, I felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the sudden focus after weeks of waiting and incremental movement. Then I saw it, properly, briefly. It was impossible to describe without sounding foolish. A fragment of something ancient, suspended in a cradle of gold and steel. It might have been bone, or metal, or something in between. Runes crawled across its surface, shifting subtly as if alive. Or perhaps that was just my eyes failing me. The air around it crackled faintly, raising the hair on my arms, despite the exhaustion weighing them down. I waited for something to happen inside me. A surge of faith, a sense of purpose, a release. Nothing came. Before I could even process the absence, a sharp tone sounded. The light dimmed. The platform shifted. rotating me away as another pilgrim was pushed into place. My 3 seconds were over. The relic receded into abstraction again, already becoming unreal in my memory. Like a dream dissolving upon waking, I was herded onward into the benediction hall, a long chamber lined with scanning larches and blessing stations. This was where the official improvement occurred. Servitors and priests worked in tandem, efficient and unhurried. Purity seals were slapped onto flesh, wax pressed into wounds that had not fully closed. Sacred oils were smeared across foreheads and exposed skin, their scent heavy and cloying. A servitor pressed a seal directly onto my chest, the wax hot enough to burn. I hissed involuntarily, and was rewarded with a corrective shock that sent my teeth clacking together. "Rejoice," the priest said mildly. "You are marked." Another scanner swept over me, its beam lingering at my head. A pause, too long. My heart hammered as I remembered the red lights, the side doors, the word reassignment whispered like a curse. The scanner chimed green, benediction complete. The priest announced, "Cell status improved." I wanted to laugh. The sound rose in my chest, sharp and hysterical, but I swallowed it down. Laughter here would be flagged as instability. Instability led to culling. As we exited the hall, I noticed movement along the chamber's edges. Groups of pilgrims, those who had completed exposure but failed some other metric, were being separated quietly, efficiently. Arbits in heavier armor escorted them through discreet doors marked with sigils I had learned to fear. There were no struggles, no screams. Just resignation. Outside the inner sanctum the air felt colder, less incense, more metal. We were ushered into an open plaza where sunlight filtered down through stained glass canopies depicting scenes of judgment and purification. For the first time since arriving on the shrine world, there was space, real space, between bodies. That was when the culling began in earnest. Arbites units moved through the crowd, scanners sweeping, visors glowing faintly. When a pilgrim was flagged, it happened quickly. A hand on the shoulder, a murmured command, a stun baton applied with practiced force. The flagged were dragged away, while the rest of us were ordered to remain still and silent. The process was surgical, almost gentle in its efficiency. I stood motionless, heart pounding, every muscle locked. I thought of the relic, of the 3 seconds I had been permitted to exist in its presence. I wondered if that moment would be weighed against whatever flaws the scanners might detect now. Fatigue, infection, doubt. I was not flagged. Relief washed over me, thin and bitter. Survival felt less like a victory and more like an accusation. Why me? What arbitrary threshold had I fallen just under while others crossed it unknowingly? When the Arbites finally withdrew, a priest addressed us from a raised platform. He congratulated us on completing the pilgrimage. He spoke of spiritual elevation, of the Emperor's notice, of the honor we carried back into the wider Imperium. His words floated above us, polished and empty. I touched the purity seal on my chest, feeling the hardened wax crack slightly under my fingers. It felt foreign, invasive, a mark of completion I did not feel. As we were escorted toward the exit corridors, I realized something that settled heavily in my gut. The relic had not changed me. The journey had not cleansed me. It had only revealed how easily the Imperium could decide who was worthy to continue existing and who was not. Survival itself, I understood now, was the real heresy. To endure without transformation, to live on unchanged by sanctioned suffering, that was what the system truly distrusted. And as I walked away from the holiest place I would ever see, I felt the eyes of scanners on my back, waiting for the moment I proved them right. They did not let us leave. That was the first truth they delivered, calmly and without apology, once the benediction was complete. We were gathered in an administrative hall that felt deliberately mundane after the excess of the reliquary, bare stone walls, exposed conduit, the faint smell of ink and ozone. A clerk stood behind a lectern, flanked by armed attendants, and informed us that departure from the shrine world required final settlement of pilgrimage liabilities. The phrasing was precise. Liabilities, as if our presence itself had been a debt accruing interest with every breath we took on holy ground. 3 options were presented, projected in large block script above us: labor, blood, confession. The clerk explained them in the same tone one might use to outline shipping methods. Labor would be assigned according to aptitude and physical viability. Blood would be tithed through sanctioned means, transfusions, marrow extraction, or other requirements as determined by Medicare assessment. Confession was reserved for those deemed spiritually compromised, its duration and outcome variable. Completion of any option would result in issuance of an exit certificate. Failure would result in reassignment. No one asked what reassignment meant anymore. I was assigned labor. A servitor scanned my body, lingering over my knees, my hands, my spine. Its cogitator whined softly, recalculating expectations downward. Still, I was deemed sufficient. A tag was clamped onto my robe, its color marking me as penitential workforce. I felt a flicker of relief at avoiding the other options, immediately followed by shame for feeling relieved at all. They marched us out beyond the inner sanctum, past areas pilgrims were never meant to see. The architecture changed subtly as we moved: less gold, more exposed steel, fewer statues, more warning signs. The air grew hotter, thicker with industrial smoke. Bells gave way to the constant clang of machinery. The monument yard sprawled across a plateau overlooking the shrine city, a forest of half-finished structures rising from the dust, columns, arches, plinths, all dedicated to saints, martyrs, and victories whose details blurred together in my mind. These monuments would stand for centuries, their surfaces polished by time and reverence. The hands that built them would not be remembered. Our work detail was assigned to stone hauling. The stone blocks were massive, quarried elsewhere and transported here on heavy lifters. They waited in long rows, each one stamped with a destination code and devotional phrase. We were to move them by hand along set tracks, guided by overseers with shock, mauls and data slates. Machines could have done the work faster. That was not the point. The first pull nearly dropped me to my knees again. Ropes bit into my raw hands, fibers grinding against open wounds. My knees protested viciously with every step, pain shooting up my legs in white, hot spikes. Around me, others strained and grunted, faces contorted, veins standing out like cords. No one spoke. Breath was too valuable. Overseers walked alongside us, correcting posture, cadence, devotion. Feel the weight, one intoned. This is the weight of your faith made manifest. When someone faltered, a shock maul crackled, and the rhythm resumed. We worked in shifts marked by bells, though the intervals felt arbitrary. Sometimes the bell came quickly, mercifully. Sometimes it did not come for what felt like an eternity. Water was issued sparingly, just enough to keep us functional. Food was a thick gruel ladled into chipped bowls, eaten standing, overseers watching to ensure nothing was wasted. At night, we were herded into pens at the edge of the yard. No roofs, just low walls and the cold stars overhead, barely visible through the smoke. The sermons played here too, broadcast from unseen speakers, reminding us that exhaustion was mercy, that pain was proof of acceptance. Bodies that did not rise in the morning were removed quietly and replaced. I stopped praying, not consciously at first. The words simply failed to form. My mouth moved out of habit, but nothing came. In their place were calculations: how to shift my grip to reduce pain, how to pace my steps to avoid collapse, how to sleep on stone without aggravating my knees further. Survival strategies crowded out faith until there was no room left. Confession was offered periodically. A priest would arrive at the yard, accompanied by scribes and guards, and announce that those struggling spiritually could come forward. Some did. They knelt, spoke quietly, were led away. A few returned days later, changed, quieter, eyes empty, tasks reassigned. Most did not return at all. I learned to keep my head down. Days blurred together. My hands calloused over old wounds, skin thickening and splitting in cycles. My knees lost sensation in places, numb patches spreading like rot. I watched a man collapse under a block, his leg crushed. The overseers paused the line only long enough to free the stone. The man was dragged away, still breathing, leaving a dark smear behind. Work resumed. At some point, I cannot say when, a clerk arrived with a data slate and began checking codes. One by one, names were called. Codes, rather. Those called were pulled from the line and escorted away. When my code was spoken, my heart lurched painfully, a reflex I thought I had lost. I was taken to a small office at the yard's edge. A clerk sat behind a desk, stacks of parchment and cogitator screens surrounding him. He scanned my tag, compared it to his slate, and nodded once. Liability satisfied, he said. Exit certificate authorized. He slid a thin sheet of stamped parchment across the desk. It bore my code, a series of sigils, and the declaration that my pilgrimage obligations had been fulfilled. The ink was fresh. The paper felt heavier than it should have. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of the labor, the pain, the bodies left behind in the dust. I was dismissed with a gesture, instructed to report to the outbound transit hub within 2 cycles. Failure to comply would result in reassignment. I walked back through the yard, certificate clutched in my hand, feeling strangely detached. Around me, the work continued unabated. Ropes strained, shock, moles cracked, stones moved inch by inch toward monuments that would outlast all of us. I did not feel victorious. I felt emptied. That night, under the cold stars, I looked at the certificate again, tracing the stamped sigils with a numb finger. This was the price of departure. Not faith, not enlightenment. Just enough labor to balance an account I had never agreed to open. And as I lay there listening to the distant clang of stone on stone, I understood that leaving the shrine world did not mean the pilgrimage was over. It only meant I had been processed sufficiently to be released back into the Imperium's wider machinery, marked, diminished, and ready to be spent elsewhere. The outbound transit hub was smaller than the one that had brought me here, tucked into the shadow of the shrine world's upper spires like an afterthought. It smelled cleaner, less incense, more sterilizer, but the orderliness felt colder, more final. Pilgrims like me arrived in dribs and drabs, limping, stooped, marked by seals and scars that told the same story in different languages. No one spoke. We all carried our certificates like fragile relics, afraid that losing them would erase our right to leave. I stood in line again. Of course I did. There was always a line. This one moved faster, but it felt heavier, as if each step carried the weight of everything I had endured to reach it. The clerk at the counter scanned my parchment without interest, eyes flicking between cogitator readouts and warning runes. He stamped it once more, the sound sharp and definitive. Pilgrimage concluded, he said. Faith obligation fulfilled, just like that. No questions. No assessment of who I had been before or what remained of me now. The system did not care about the internal cost, only that the external requirements had been met. My suffering had been sufficient, my endurance acceptable, my continued existence authorized. They took the certificate after stamping it, filing it away in a slot marked completed tithers. I felt a moment of panic as it left my hand, a reflexive fear that without it I might vanish. In its place they issued a transit chit, thin, impersonal, stamped with a destination code I did not recognize. Where I was going no longer mattered to me, only that I was leaving. The transport ship waiting for us was smaller than the coffin fleet vessels, but it shared their utilitarian ugliness. It was quieter too, fewer bodies, more space. I sat alone on a bench near the hull, hands folded in my lap, and listened as the engines warmed. The silence pressed in on me, unfamiliar and uncomfortable after so long surrounded by noise. As the ship lifted, I felt the shrine world fall away beneath us. There was no sense of loss, no longing to look back. I watched the spires recede through a narrow viewport, their gilded tops catching the light one last time before the clouds swallowed them. Somewhere down there, the processional way was being scrubbed clean again. The queues were filling. The monuments were rising. The system continued, perfectly indifferent to my departure. In the quiet, memories crept in uninvited. The sound of the stamp in the administratum hall, the press of bodies in the coffin fleet, the sirens at the holy perimeter, the scrape of stone on exposed bone, the endless waiting beneath chanting that never stopped, the brief, hollow sight of the relic behind glass and guns, the weight of stone biting into ruined knees. They replayed without emotion, like data logs accessed by mistake. I realized with a distant shock that I felt nothing about them, not anger, not pride, not even grief. The pilgrimage had not broken me in some dramatic way. It had simply worn me down until reaction itself felt unnecessary. I slept during transit, real sleep, for the first time in what felt like years. When I woke, my joints screamed and my hands ached, but the pain felt familiar now, almost comforting. It reminded me I was still present, still occupying a body that had not yet been requisitioned for something else. When we docked, the destination proved unremarkable, a redistribution hub orbiting a mid-tier world, neither holy nor damned enough to be memorable. Officials processed us quickly, checking codes, assigning onward routes. I was given new papers, work authorization, habitation assignment, ration eligibility. My pilgrimage was noted as completed, a line item among many. No one asked me about my faith. I was older, I realized then, not in years though I had certainly aged, but in posture, in the way I moved, in how carefully I conserved energy. I had learned habits that would never leave me, scanning rooms for authority figures, waking at the slightest sound, measuring every action against potential punishment. The shrine world had trained me well. Sometimes when I am alone, I touch the faint scar on my chest where the purity seal burned into my skin. The wax is long gone, but the mark remains, pale and irregular. It does not fill me with reverence. It reminds me that even my devotion was temporary, applied and removed as needed. I try to pray occasionally. The words still exist somewhere in my memory, but they feel distant, like a language I once knew and no longer speak fluently. When I force them out, they feel performative, hollow. I suspect that is enough. The Imperium never required sincerity, only compliance. I know my faith is recorded somewhere. Log, archived. A completed obligation with timestamps and verification codes. If queried, the system will confirm that I did what was required of me, that I suffered appropriately, that I was improved. What it will not record is what was taken. It will not note the way hope thinned and finally disappeared. It will not log the small, human expectations I shed along the way, discarded to make room for endurance. It will not care that I returned unchanged in the ways that mattered, carrying only fatigue and a deeper understanding of my own expendability. I am still alive. That, in itself, feels suspicious. The Imperium will spend me again, I am sure. In a manufactorum, a hab block, a work gang, or a battlefield I have not yet imagined. When that happens, my pilgrimage will be cited as proof of resilience, a justification for further use. Faith recorded. Life expended incrementally, until nothing remains worth logging. This is my confession, then, not of sin, but of survival. I went to a shrine world seeking meaning and returned with documentation. I endured holiness enforced by scanners and shock moles, and I was found sufficient. And if there is any truth left in me, it is this: in the Imperium. Even hope has a quota, and I have already used mine. Do you want me to continue with anything else, or would you like a new story?